Pets aren't allowed, he said automatically, not bothering to look up. Could a hero be turned away in her darkest hour? Outside, the wind howled and the sky turned black, the tornado sirens wailing as Evelyn Grant, 68, a Medal of Honor recipient, stood in the freezing rain with Shadow pressed close by her side. She didn't argue, she had weathered bigger storms, but then, a phone rang inside the shelter, a call from the Pentagon itself. Calm, firm, and undeniable. Open those doors, the voice said. She is not just a veteran, she is an American hero, and in that single quiet moment, everything changed. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The wind howled like a freight train as the tornado warnings crackled over the radio. In a small town in the Midwest, the FEMA emergency shelter was already at capacity. Families huddled together on folding cots, children clinging to stuffed animals, the air thick with the scent of fear and sweat. Evelyn Grant, at 68 years old, stood just outside the center's main doors, clutching the worn leash of her loyal dog, Shadow, her military ID tucked in the breast pocket of her weather jacket, the same one she'd worn during her days in the Gulf War. Shadow pressed close to her leg, his dark eyes steady and alert, a quiet anchor against the chaos. The sky above churned with black clouds, roiling like an angry sea. Lightning flickered in the distance, thunder growling low and ominous. Evelyn could feel the weight of the storm in her bones, that old ache that never left her since the desert sands of the Gulf. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy door of the shelter, Shadow at her side. The room beyond was a patchwork of sleeping bags and nervous whispers. A volunteer in a neon vest looked up from his clipboard, eyebrows knitting together as he took in the sight of Evelyn. And the dog name, he asked, his voice clipped, distracted by the endless line of anxious faces waiting to be checked in. Evelyn Grant, she replied, steady and clear. Her voice had that quiet authority, the kind you earn from years of doing the job no one else wanted. The volunteer's eyes dropped to Shadow, tail wagging gently. Waiting. Pets aren't allowed, he said automatically, not bothering to look up. Evelyn's shoulders squared, her chin lifting a fraction. He's not a pet, she said calmly, he's my service dog. He's been with me since the Gulf. The young man's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he flipped through the papers on his clipboard, searching for the right box to check. Around them, the wind rattled the windows, a reminder that time was slipping away. Evelyn's hand rested lightly on Shadow's head, her fingers brushing the thick fur in a slow, measured rhythm. Finally, the volunteer looked up again, his expression caught somewhere between apology and dismissal. Do you have proof of residence within the city limits? He asked. Evelyn blinked. I moved out last year, she said, the truth in her voice. Retired to a small town nearby, but I still pay taxes here. I served here, I bled here. The man's lips thinned. I'm sorry, ma'am, but policy says only current residents are eligible. We're at capacity as it is. He glanced around the crowded room as if the noise and the fear gave him an excuse to look away from her. You'll have to find somewhere else. Somewhere else. Evelyn felt those words settle in her chest like cold stones. She turned to glance outside. The wind screamed through the streets, rattling stop signs and snapping tree limbs like twigs. Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze steady and calm. Sir, she said quietly, I fought for this country, my dog and I, we both earned a place here tonight. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. She spoke with the calm, unshakable certainty of someone who knew what it meant to stand alone. But the volunteer only shook his head. I'm sorry, he said again, a little softer this time. It's just policy. He turned away, already moving on to the next name on the list. Evelyn stepped back, the door clicking shut behind her. The cold wind slapped against her face, rain lashing in sheets that stung her cheeks. She tightened her grip on Shadow's leash, feeling the weight of the metal she no longer wore. Shadow pressed closer to her side, his head low, but his steps steady. She reached down and scratched his ear, a silent promise in her touch. We've weathered worse, haven't we, boy, she murmured. But even as she spoke, she felt the fear clawing at the edges of her resolve. She wasn't afraid of the storm. She'd faced storms in the desert, storms of fire and metal, but this, being turned away from the place she thought of as home, that cut deeper than any bullet. A man passing by gave her a brief glance, then hurried on, his own worries too heavy to shoulder hers. Another volunteer pushed past with a box of bottled water, not seeing her at all. The world had shrunk to the howling wind and the tremble of Shadow's breath beside her. She thought of the old unit photo in her wallet, the one from the Gulf, 8 faces grinning in the sun, dust and sweat on their skin. She thought of the mission that earned her the Medal of Honor, of the night she and Shadow crawled through enemy fire to pull out 2 wounded men. No medals on her chest now, but the memory was still there, still real. She could feel the ache in her knees, the old injuries that never fully healed. Shadow leaned against her leg as if he knew her thoughts. She took another breath, steadying her mind. She had learned a long time ago fear and doubt were luxuries she couldn't afford. Could a single act of courage rewrite this night? A young woman, maybe in her 20s, paused a few feet away, phone clutched in her hands. She watched Evelyn for a moment, her brows furrowing. Then, with a quick glance at the swirling sky, she raised her phone and began to record. Evelyn noticed, But she didn't react, she simply stood there, the leash in her hand, Shadow's head pressed against her thigh. The camera captured the whole scene. The old veteran turned away, the dog at her side, the wind ripping at her hair and the battered jacket that bore the patch of her old unit. The young woman stepped closer, lowering her phone. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the roar of the storm, "do you need help?" Evelyn met her eyes and shook her head. "No," she said, her voice even. "We'll manage." The girl hesitated, then nodded, and turned away, the video already uploading to the world beyond these rain-slick streets. Evelyn let her go. She didn't need sympathy, she needed shelter, a safe place for Shadow to lay his head. But tonight, it seemed there was no room at the inn. The wind rose again, keening like a siren. She looked down at Shadow and nodded once. Her decision made. "We'll wait it out," she whispered. "We'll stand until the storm passes." So she stood, the leash in her hand, Shadow by her side. The night pressed in, the storm howling louder, but Evelyn Grant had weathered storms before, and she would stand again tonight. The wind pressed harder against the doors of the emergency shelter, rattling the metal frame. Evelyn Grant stood rooted to the spot, the cold biting through her jacket as she faced the volunteer once more. The man's clipboard was a barrier between them, and his eyes darted away. When she spoke, "Please," Evelyn said, her voice still calm, but more insistent, "I served in the Gulf, Shadow and I. We carried wounded men out of mortar fire, we saved lives." The young man's face didn't change, he just shook his head again like he didn't hear the weight of her words. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, a rehearsed phrase that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not personal, we have policies to follow." Evelyn's hand tightened on Shadow's leash, knuckles white beneath a thin leather glove. The dog leaned in closer, his head brushing her knee like a quiet reassurance. She tried one more time, her voice almost a whisper. "I earned the Medal of Honor," she said, the words falling like small stones into the storm. "Not for me, for what we did together, for what Shadow did." The volunteer looked up then, just for a heartbeat. There was a flicker, maybe recognition, maybe doubt, but then he cleared his throat and turned away, calling for the next in line. A young man behind Evelyn shifted awkwardly, his eyes dropping to the floor. A woman holding a baby squeezed past, her gaze flicking to Evelyn's face and then away again. No one wanted to see her standing there in the cold, no one wanted to be the one to stand beside her. She stepped back from the doorway, the icy rain slashing across her face. Her shoulders felt heavy with memories she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Shadow stood steady beside her, his breath calm and even, his eyes watching the door that had just closed on them. A small crowd gathered in the hallway behind the glass. A young woman in a dark parka raised her phone, the small lens catching the tension in the air. Evelyn didn't flinch, she met the camera with the same quiet dignity she'd carried for decades. The woman filming stepped closer, her brows knitted in anger. "This isn't right," she murmured under her breath. She tapped her phone screen and in seconds the video joined the digital river flowing out to the world. Evelyn watched the way the woman's hands trembled with purpose. Outside, the storm raged louder, the wind snapped at the flags on the corner, pulling at the seams of old canvas. Evelyn's thoughts drifted back sudden, unbidden to a night long ago in a place half a world away. She could still smell the burning oil, the distant echo of explosions rolling across the desert sand. She was younger then, 33, but already older in ways no one could see. Shadow was at her side, a dark shape against the bright flashes of gunfire. They had crawled through sand and shattered stone, each breath thick with dust and fear. 8 men lay wounded in the open, pinned by mortar fire that fell like rain. Shadow never faltered, he moved with a purpose Evelyn could only hope to match. She remembered how he'd braced against her leg, muscles coiled, every breath measured. Together, they dragged the first man to safety, bullets snapping through the air, then the second, then the third. When they reached the last man, Evelyn's arms shook with exhaustion, her knees bled from the sharp rocks, but Shadow kept going. His teeth found the man's sleeve, pulling him inch by inch out of the line of fire. When they finally reached cover, she collapsed, her breath ragged in the sand. Later, a general would pin the Medal of Honor to her chest, but in that moment, all that mattered was Shadow's quiet strength beside her. She had promised herself that night, promised him that she would never let him be left behind. Not then, not now. The wind tore her back to the present, the hull of it drowning out the dull murmur of voices in the shelter. She looked down at Shadow, his eyes calm, unwavering. "Not tonight, old friend," she whispered, "not tonight." A car slowed at the curb, headlights sweeping over the wet pavement. A man inside looked out, his face pale in the dim light, phone in hand. He didn't get out, but Evelyn saw the glow of the screen in his hands, the video of her and Shadow already spreading. Inside the shelter, the woman with the phone lowered her camera, her eyes meeting Evelyn's through the glass. "I shared it," she mouthed, and Evelyn nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of the silent witness she hadn't asked for. The rain grew colder, needling through the seams of her jacket. Shadow shifted, pressing his weight against her leg. His presence was a quiet shield against the storm. Minutes passed, no one opened the door, no one came to stand beside her, but the video kept moving across screens, across towns, across hearts that still remembered what service meant. A ripple of indignation, a spark of something larger than any policy or clipboard. Somewhere in that growing storm of voices, there were men and women who knew her name, who had worn the same uniform, who had carried the same weight. She didn't need them to fight for her, but she knew they would. The sky cracked with a sudden bolt of lightning, the ground shuddering beneath her boots. Shadow didn't flinch. Evelyn felt that same steadiness rise in her chest. She thought again of that desert night, of how Shadow had pulled those men to safety, his paws slipping in the sand. She thought of the promise she'd made, she would keep it, no matter how cold the rain or how long the wait inside. She could see the volunteers still checking names, his head bent low. He didn't look up, he didn't see her, but others did, on their phones, in their homes. In the quiet spaces of their hearts, Evelyn stood a little taller. She adjusted the old field jacket she'd worn for decades, the patch on her shoulder catching the light of a passing car. She wasn't here to beg, she was here to stand. Shadow's tail flicked once, a quiet sign of trust. They had faced worse together, they would face this, too. The wind roared again, sending papers skittering across the street. The woman with the phone stepped back inside the shelter, her fingers still tapping, still sharing. Somewhere, someone was watching. Somewhere, someone was remembering. The storm pressed on, but Evelyn Grant and Shadow stood side by side, as they always had, ready, unmoving, unbroken. And beyond the glass, in the warmth of the shelter, the first whispers of something larger began to stir, a call to those who still believed, a call to those who would not forget. And Evelyn knew the wait would not be in vain. Inside the shelter, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and tension. The volunteer behind the clipboard kept his head down, not daring to meet Evelyn's steady gaze through the glass. The rain battered the windows in relentless sheets, each gust of wind a hammer against the trembling frame. Somewhere deeper in the building, the phone at the front desk rang. The sharp trill cut through the murmurs of crowded voices and the low hum of the emergency generator. The shelter's director, a man named Frank Connolly, glanced at it once, irritation flickering across his features. He had enough problems tonight, he didn't need another. He lifted the receiver with a weary sigh. "This is Director Connolly," he said, his tone tired and perfunctory, but the voice on the other end was anything but weary. "Director Connolly," the caller said, calm and measured, "this is Colonel Andrew Vance calling from the Pentagon." The words cut through the noise of the shelter like a blade. Frank straightened, the blood draining from his face. Colonel, what can I do for you?" he stammered, his hand trembling just slightly, the phone pressing tighter against his ear. "There's a woman standing outside your door right now," the colonel said. "Her name is Evelyn Grant. She is a Medal of Honor recipient. Her dog, Shadow, saved lives in the Gulf War." Frank swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, sir, I know who she is," he managed. "Then why?" the colonel continued, each word deliberate and cold. "Is she standing in the rain while your staff turns her away?" Frank's mind raced. He could feel the heat of 100 eyes in the shelter, even though none of them were looking at him. I was following protocol, sir," he said, the words clumsy and hollow even to his own ears. "Forget your protocol," the colonel snapped. "This is not a request, this is an order. You will open those doors and treat her with the honor she has earned." There was no anger in the voice, just that steady, unbreakable calm, the kind of calm that left no room for argument. "Yes, sir," Frank said quickly. "Right away." But the line was already dead. He lowered the receiver slowly, his hands shaking as he set it back in the cradle. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at the silent phone like it might ring again. Then he drew a deep breath and turned, his shoulders squaring with sudden purpose. He pushed past the volunteers, his footsteps quick and heavy on the worn linoleum. The murmurs in the shelter fell away as he reached the door. He paused for just a moment, his hand on the handle, gathering his courage. Outside, Evelyn stood in the rain, her head high and her eyes steady. Shadow pressed close against her leg, his ears flicking back at the noise of the wind. Frank felt a stab of shame twist in his chest, deeper than any storm outside. He pulled the door open wide, the cold air rushing in like a wave. "Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice catching, "please come in. I'm so sorry for the delay." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, the rain dripping from the brim of her old cap. She saw the lines of fear and regret etched into his face. She saw the truth there in the weight of it. She nodded once, a gesture of quiet forgiveness. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she stepped forward, Shadow moving in perfect step beside her. The warmth of the shelter hit her like a soft blanket, the air thick with the mingled smells of coffee and damp clothes. For a moment, she stood just inside the doorway, blinking against the sudden brightness. The chatter in the room faded to a hush, eyes turning toward her as if drawn by an invisible thread. Frank cleared his throat, his hands twisting together. "Again, he said, his voice unsteady, "you and your dog are welcome here. You've always been welcome." Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't need to. She reached down and touched Shadow's head, her fingers steady and sure. As she walked deeper into the room, she felt the weight of the past settle around her shoulders, not a burden, but a mantle she'd worn for decades. She remembered the faces of the men she'd carried out of that firestorm in the desert, their breath ragged and their eyes wide with terror. She remembered the promise she'd made to them in the darkness of that night. No man left behind, no one forgotten, and Shadow always Shadow beside her in every step. Her mind flickered back to that night in the Gulf, the sand hot beneath her knees, the roar of mortar fire echoing through the night. Shadow's coat was slick with sweat, his breath hot against her cheek as they pulled another Man to safety, she had whispered to him then, soft words only he would hear. We're family, boy, you and me. And family never leaves one another behind. That promise had carried them through every storm since, and tonight it carried them here into the warmth and safety of a room full of strangers who could not truly understand, but some part of her believed maybe they didn't have to, maybe it was enough that she and Shadow still stood together. Frank guided her to an empty cot near the back. His head still bowed low. Please, if there's anything you need, he began. But Evelyn shook her head. We're fine, she said softly, we've weathered worse. Shadow circled once and settled at her feet, his eyes bright and watchful. Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She could feel the eyes of the room still on her, but she didn't shrink from it. She had nothing to hide. The wind outside howled on, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. But inside there was warmth, inside there was a quiet respect that settled over the room like a soft blanket, and Evelyn let it be enough. She closed her eyes for a moment, the images of the past and present weaving together in the darkness behind her eyelids. She thought of the men she'd saved, their lives woven into her own. She thought of the promise she'd kept for so long, and she thought of Shadow, his breath slow and steady beside her, the constant in every chapter of her life. Frank lingered nearby, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes clear. He knew he had made a mistake, he knew he would not make it again. The young woman who had filmed the video stepped forward, her phone still in her hand. I'm sorry, she said softly, her voice shaking. I didn't know what else to do. I wanted people to see. Evelyn met her gaze, her own eyes calm and kind. You did the right thing, she said. Sometimes it takes just one voice to remind the world what matters. The woman nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She stepped back, her shoulders relaxing as she joined the others, and in that quiet moment, Evelyn Grant let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She reached down and touched Shadow's head again, her fingers gentle. You did good, boy, she whispered. You did real good. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, Evelyn and Shadow were home, not because of walls or a roof, but because they had stood their ground together, and in that quiet, battered shelter, they had found a place where they were seen, a place where they belonged, and that was enough. As the last echoes of the colonel's voice faded from the phone, a hush settled over the crowded shelter. People shifted in their seats, some rising slowly, eyes lingering on Evelyn and Shadow like a quiet benediction. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The storm outside, a distant drum beat to the steady calm within these walls. One by one they stood, the young mother with a baby bundled tight against her chest, the old man with trembling hands and a worn cap clutched to his heart. Each of them moved aside, creating a path. No orders given, no words needed. Frank Connolly stepped back, his voice low but firm. Please, he said, gesturing to a chair near the heater. You've more than earned a warm seat tonight. Evelyn hesitated only a breath before nodding. Once she moved forward, Shadow padding softly beside her, his coat still damp from the storm. As she walked, a ripple of gratitude moved through the room. Few people clapped softly, the sound gentle, almost reverent. No cheers, just a quiet chorus of respect. Evelyn lowered herself into the chair, her back straight, her head high. Shadow curled at her feet, his tail thumping once before he settled. For the first time in hours, Evelyn allowed herself to exhale fully. She didn't ask for applause, she didn't want it. All she'd ever wanted was to be treated like anyone else, to be seen, not for the medal she wore once, but for the life she'd carried since. Tonight, that wish was enough. Frank knelt beside her, his hands folded tight, his shoulders slumped with shame. I was wrong, he said, his voice rough with something close to tears. I forgot what this place is supposed to stand for, what you stand for. His eyes flicked to Shadow, then back to her. I promise this will never happen again. Not here. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, her own eyes calm, forgiving. Then she nodded, a small, quiet gesture that spoke volumes. Thank you, she said simply, because sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be shouted, it only needs to be given. The woman who'd filmed the video stepped closer, phone clutched to her chest like a lifeline. It's everywhere now, she said softly. People are sharing it, talking about what happened. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were bright with hope. It's changing things. Evelyn didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just reached down, her hand resting on Shadow's head, fingers tracing the damp fur with a tenderness that spoke of years shared, battles fought together. The room seemed to settle around them, the hush growing deeper, more sacred. In that stillness, Evelyn's mind drifted back briefly, like a passing shadow, to the men she'd fought beside, to the weight of their lives in her hands, the promises whispered in foxholes and empty corridors. She had kept those promises all these years. Tonight, she had kept them still. The wind outside rattled the windows again, but it sounded softer now, like a lullaby instead of a warning. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the gentle breathing of those around her. She didn't need medals or fanfare, she just needed this quiet proof that kindness still mattered. Frank stood slowly, his back straightening as he turned to the room. Let this be the last time anyone here forgets, he said, his voice gaining strength. No one who's worn the uniform, no one who's carried the weight should ever be turned away. Around him, heads nodded in solemn agreement. Even those who had once looked away now looked at Evelyn with a new respect. Outside, the storm still howled, But it couldn't touch the warmth that had settled inside the shelter. The video of Evelyn and Shadow had already begun to travel beyond these walls, across towns and states, a beacon of quiet strength. In homes lit by candlelight, in crowded coffee shops, people watched and remembered, and somewhere far from here, other veterans nodded to themselves, their own memories stirred by the sight of an old soldier and her faithful dog. Evelyn didn't think about any of that, she didn't need to, and she focused on Shadow, his eyes half closed, his breath steady. She stroked the rough fur along his neck, her thumb brushing the scar he'd carried since that night in the desert. "We're safe now," she murmured, the words meant for him alone. The woman with the baby approached, her eyes wet with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. Evelyn looked up, her expression gentle. "Just doing what I was trained to do," she replied, her voice low but clear. The room began to settle again, people returning to their cots, to their small conversations and cups of coffee. But something had shifted, some quiet understanding that lingered in the air. Evelyn felt it like a warm current in her chest. She didn't need the world to see it, she only needed to know it was real. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes closing for a moment as she let her breathing slow. Shadow shifted closer, his head resting on her boot, his tail curling around her foot like a silent bow. The shelter was full of strangers, but in that moment, it felt like family. Frank moved to the front door, posting a new sign on the glass in bold black letters. It read, "All veterans and their service. Animals welcome, no exceptions." He turned back to Evelyn, his mouth set in a firm line of resolve. She nodded once, the corner of her mouth lifting in a small, weary smile. Outside, the storm would rage on through the night, but inside these walls, there was shelter. Inside these walls, there was a reminder that some debts could never be repaid, only honored. Evelyn knew that tomorrow the world would move on and the video would fade, the news cycle would shift, and people would forget. But she also knew that somewhere in the hearts of those who had watched, something would remain, a small spark of memory, a reminder of what dignity looks like. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead briefly to Shadow's, feeling the warmth of his breath against her skin. "You're a good boy," she whispered, "and we're home now." In the quiet that followed, Evelyn let her thoughts drift. She thought of the men she'd carried, the weight of their lives, the weight of her own, and she thought of Shadow, always Shadow by her side through every storm. In that simple moment, she understood something deeper than words. Even in the fiercest storm, even in the coldest night, there would always be those who remembered, who saw not the uniform or the medals, but the quiet strength of a heart that never stopped giving. As she sat there, her hand resting on the dog who had shared every battle, Evelyn Grant allowed herself one small silent truth, that even when the world forgets, kindness does not. And in the stillness of the emergency shelter, with the storm outside and the warmth within, she let that truth carry her into the night, because tonight she and Shadow were seen, and that was enough. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.